Nick stared across the dinner table, his fork halfway to his mouth as Ava's wrist glinted under the low light of the chandelier. The bracelet, an intricate weave of diamonds and platinum, was new and undeniably expensive. She'd brushed off his earlier remark about it, muttering something vague about finding it on sale. But this wasn't the kind of sale you'd stumble upon in a department store. This was luxury. "Do they sell private islands at this discount shop of yours?" Nick asked, his voice tinged with forced humor. Ava barely looked up, her attention fixed on her plate. "I told you, Nick. Work bonus. You know how hard I've been pushing this quarter?" But Nick did know. Ava's salary as a mid-level manager at a marketing firm couldn't explain the recent cascade of indulgences. A $200 bottle of wine had appeared on their countertop last week. "A client gift," she'd said with a laugh, brushing it off as casually as she had the designer shoes, the handbag, and now this bracelet. He wanted to believe her. For years he'd admired Ava's charisma and charm, the ease with which she navigated social circles. But as he glanced again at the glimmering diamonds, an unwelcome suspicion coiled tightly around his thoughts. It wasn't just the bracelet. It was the perfume that didn't smell like her usual. It was the late nights working that seemed to have no corresponding overtime on her pay stubs. Nick let the silence stretch, hoping she'd offer more. Ava didn't, her focus remaining on her food, her shoulders too relaxed, as though she were daring him to press further. That night, while Ava showered, Nick's curiosity overcame his reluctance. The invoices were hidden in plain sight, folded between two grocery receipts in the kitchen drawer. A handbag worth 2 months of their mortgage, jewelry he hadn't given her, a boutique store he'd never heard of. The signature on the receipts wasn't hers, and the attached card name read Marcus Bennett. Nick's heart pounded. He didn't recognize the name. A coworker? A friend? The questions swirled faster than the answers could form. As Ava exited the bathroom, her damp hair curling softly at her shoulders, Nick stuffed the receipts back into the drawer and turned to the fridge. "Do you want tea?" he asked, his voice unnaturally steady. Ava smiled faintly, still distracted. "Sure. Green if we have it." He watched her disappear into the bedroom, her movements light and carefree, as if nothing in her world had shifted. But for Nick, everything had. He brewed the tea mechanically, his mind calculating the next steps. Ignoring the evidence wasn't an option, but neither was impulsively confronting her without understanding the full scope. Tomorrow, he would find out who Marcus Bennett was. Nick's Saturday began with an unusual quiet, the kind that feels unnatural. Ava had left early, a hastily mumbled excuse about a brunch meeting with clients. Normally, he'd brush it off, but today, his mind was too preoccupied with Marcus Bennett. While sipping his coffee, Nick opened his laptop and began his search. He started with the invoices, noting the boutique's name and cross-referencing it with local shops. The trail wasn't hard to follow. Marcus had used a credit card to pay for the luxury items, and the transactions weren't subtle. Nick dug deeper. Marcus Bennett, 40 years old, regional director for a real estate firm. His profile picture showed a man with a winning smile, sharp suit, and the kind of confidence that money and power exude. There was no connection to Ava's company, at least none that Nick could see. But as he scrolled through the list of Marcus's connections, Ava's name wasn't there either, which felt suspicious in its own way. Switching gears, Nick sifted through Ava's social media accounts, which had become increasingly sparse in recent months. While he couldn't find anything incriminating, the absence of activity was glaring. Ava, once the queen of sharing work milestones and dinner party selfies, had gone quiet. Too quiet. Feeling the weight of his suspicions, Nick grabbed his phone. "I'll just confirm it's nothing," he muttered to himself, dialing a friend who worked in private investigations. "Mike, I need a favor," Nick said, his voice hesitant but firm. By mid-afternoon, Mike had emailed him a discreet background check on Marcus. It was thorough: addresses, employment history, even a list of cars registered in his name. But it was the credit card details that struck a nerve. Among the charges for hotels, high-end restaurants, and expensive jewelry, one location stood out: Rendezvous Wine Bar, a spot Ava had casually mentioned visiting with co-workers. Nick's stomach tightened. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. It was an easy place to name drop. But now it clicked into place. That evening, Nick decided to visit the boutique where one of Marcus's receipts originated. He entered with an air of calm detachment, casually browsing the displays. A helpful sales associate approached, her smile practiced and polite. "Looking for anything special?" she asked. Nick produced a photo of the bracelet Ava had been wearing. "This caught my eye. Do you remember selling something like this recently?" The woman studied the image before nodding. "Yes, we sold this piece a few weeks ago. It's one of our exclusives." She paused, hesitant. "I think Mr. Bennett purchased it. He's one of our regulars." Nick's stomach churned. "Was it a gift?" She smiled politely. "We wrapped it for him. Beautiful piece. Lucky lady." Nick forced a smile in return. "Very lucky," he said, his tone masking the anger bubbling beneath the surface. As he walked out of the store, the weight of what he'd uncovered sank in. Marcus wasn't just a passing flirtation or casual fling. He was part of Ava's life in a way Nick could no longer ignore. Nick waited until the evening to confront Ava, the weight of the day's discoveries sitting heavy in his chest. When she walked through the front door, a shopping bag in one hand and her phone in the other, she seemed relaxed, humming softly as she set her things down. "Busy day?" Nick asked, his voice carefully measured. Ava glanced at him, startled by the sudden question. "Yeah, just work stuff," she said, shrugging off her coat. "You know how it is." "I don't," Nick replied, rising from the couch. "But maybe you can enlighten me." Ava turned to him, her brow furrowing. "What's with the tone? Did something happen?" Nick held her gaze, feeling his restraint slipping. "You tell me, Ava. You've been coming home with designer handbags, expensive jewelry, and stories that don't add up. And today I learned who's really paying for all of it." The color drained from Ava's face. "What are you talking about?" Nick stepped closer, his voice calm but icy. "Marcus Bennett. Ring a bell?" Her eyes darted away, a telltale sign Nick had learned to recognize over the years. "He's a client. I've mentioned him before. A client who buys you bracelets, wine, and God knows what else?" Nick asked, his voice rising. "Come on, Ava, don't insult my intelligence." Ava's mouth opened and closed, searching for a response. "It's not what you think," she finally said, her voice defensive. "Marcus is just generous. It's part of his nature." "Generous? So generous he's paying for your private lunches and boutique shopping sprees," Nick shot back, his frustration spilling over. "Do you think I'm blind or just stupid?" Ava crossed her arms, her own temper flaring. "I didn't ask for any of it, Nick. He offered. And maybe, for once, it felt nice to be appreciated." The words hit Nick like a slap. "Appreciated? What are you saying? That I don't appreciate you enough? Is that why you've been sneaking around?" Her defenses cracked and tears welled in her eyes. "You're always working, Nick. Always planning, always thinking ahead. Do you know how lonely it feels when you're physically here but mentally somewhere else?" Nick's anger simmered as he tried to process her words. "And that justifies lying to me? Accepting gifts from another man? It wasn't supposed to be like this," Ava whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to get this far." Nick stared at her, disbelief mingling with disappointment. "How far did it go, Ava?" Her silence was answer enough. "Unbelievable," Nick said, turning away. The hurt was almost unbearable, but he knew this wasn't over. "You've made your choice, Ava. Now it's time for me to make mine." As he walked away, Ava called after him, but her voice was distant, muffled by the storm in Nick's mind. He didn't know what the next step would be, but one thing was clear. His marriage had reached a breaking point, and nothing would ever be the same. Nick spent the next 2 days in a fog of anger and disbelief, his mind replaying Ava's words and the bitter confrontation that followed. He stayed late at the office, avoiding the cold silence of their shared home. But as much as he tried to bury himself in work, the betrayal loomed over him. Finally, he decided that action was the only way forward. When Nick arrived home that evening, Ava was waiting. She sat at the kitchen table, her face pale and anxious, as if she'd been rehearsing what to say. "Nick, we need to talk," she began. But he cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "You've done enough talking," Nick said, dropping a manila folder onto the table. "Now it's my turn." Ava eyed the folder warily. "What's this?" "Proof," Nick said flatly. "Bank statements, receipts, and a few other things I had looked into. I know exactly what Marcus has been funding, and I know how long it's been going." Her lips parted, but no words came out. The weight of the evidence left no room for denial. Nick leaned on the back of the chair opposite her, his knuckles white against the wood. "I'm done being lied to, Ava. You've made it clear where your priorities are, and it's not this marriage." "Nick, wait," she started, but he held up his hand again. "I'm not interested in excuses," he said firmly. "What I want is simple. You're cut off. As of tonight, I'm closing our joint accounts and freezing the credit cards. If you want to keep living this appreciated lifestyle, you can let Marcus foot the bill." Ava blinked, stunned. You can't just— Yes, I can, Nick interrupted, his voice cold. You've treated me like a backup plan, Ava, like a safety net while you indulge yourself on someone else's dime. But I'm done funding your betrayal. Tears welled in her eyes and her voice wavered. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I felt so lost, Nick, so invisible. Nick's chest tightened, a small part of him still aching for the woman he had once loved. But he steeled himself, unwilling to let her tears sway him. You could have talked to me, he said quietly. Instead, you lied. He made me the fool. Ava's face crumpled and she reached for his hand. Please, Nick, let me fix this. I'll end it with Marcus. We could go back to how things were. Nick pulled his hand away, shaking his head. No, Ava, we can't go back. You made sure of that. She sat frozen, her tears falling silently as Nick picked up his coat and headed for the door. You're on your own now, he said over his shoulder. Let's see how far Marcus is willing to go when it's not just gifts he has to pay for. As the door clicked shut behind him, Ava's sobs filled the empty house, a haunting echo of what she had lost. Ava sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the black screen of the TV. The silence of the house was deafening, a stark contrast to the once vibrant energy that filled it. She picked up her phone for the 100th time, her thumb hovering over Marcus's contact. Her thoughts whirled. Would he be there for her now? Or had she overestimated his generosity? Marcus had always been charming, confident, and attentive, the perfect distraction from the monotony Ava had felt in her marriage. But now that Nick had cut her off, the allure of Marcus's wealth and affection was tinged with uncertainty. Her text to him the night Nick walked out had gone unanswered. He'd always been quick to reply before. Finally, she decided to call. The phone rang 3 times before Marcus's voice came on, smooth as ever but colder than she remembered. Ava, he said, his tone measured. What's going on? She hesitated. Nick knows, she blurted, her voice trembling. He found out about everything. He's cut me off. The credit cards, everything. I don't know what to do. There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment Ava thought the call had dropped. Then Marcus spoke, his words slow and deliberate. I'm sorry to hear that, Ava. But you know, this was never meant to be complicated. Complicated? Ava echoed, her voice rising. You're the one who pushed me into this. The gifts, the trips, it was all you. And it was fun, Marcus interrupted, his voice hardening. But I'm not looking to play house. You had your arrangement with Nick, and now it's messy. Ava's chest tightened. So that's it? You're done? I've got a lot on my plate right now, Marcus said, his tone dismissive. I can't afford distractions. The line went dead, and Ava stared at her phone in disbelief. The man she'd risked everything for had just discarded her like an old receipt. Over the next week, reality began to set in. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The bills started to pile up. Utilities, car payments, groceries. And without access to their joint finances, Ava was forced to confront the depth of her dependence on Nick. She made a few half-hearted attempts to apologize, texting and calling him, but he either ignored her or responded curtly. At work, whispers followed her through the office. It seemed everyone knew something was wrong. Ava's co-workers, once friendly, now avoided her. She overheard snippets of conversations, her name paired with Marcus's. The rumors spreading like wildfire. Her boss called her in one afternoon, his expression stern. Ava, he said, I've been hearing things about your relationship with Marcus Bennett. That kind of behavior reflects poorly on this company. It's personal, she stammered, her cheeks burning with shame. Personal or not, it's affecting your professional reputation, he replied. I'm putting you on probation. Get your act together. As she left his office, the full weight of her decisions bore down on her. Marcus had vanished. Nick wanted nothing to do with her, and now even her career was in jeopardy. Meanwhile, Nick was rebuilding his life. He'd moved into a small apartment across town, a far cry from the home he'd shared with Ava. But it felt peaceful, a fresh start. He focused on his work, reconnecting with old friends he'd neglected during his marriage, and rediscovering parts of himself he'd forgotten. Ava tried to reach him one last time, showing up unannounced at his apartment. When he opened the door, she looked thinner, her eyes red and hollow. Nick, she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. I've lost everything. Please? Let's talk. Nick sighed, leaning against the doorframe. Ava, I've thought a lot about this, about us, and I realized I deserve someone who values what we built together, not someone who looks for fulfillment outside of it. Tears streamed down her face. I made a mistake, a horrible mistake, but I still love you. You love the life we had, Nick said softly, shaking his head. But you didn't love me enough to protect it. I've moved on, Ava. You should too. He closed the door, the sound final and heavy. Months later, Ava sat in a tiny, sparsely furnished apartment, flipping through old photos on her phone. Images of her and Nick, smiling and happy, mocked her. She had reached out to her family, but their disappointment was clear. Her attempts to reconnect with friends had been met with polite distance. She had traded a stable, loving marriage for a fleeting thrill, and had been left with nothing but regret. Every day she woke up to the consequences of her choices, knowing that the life she once had was gone forever.